Hello, and welcome to another discussion on Christian apologetics or Christian evidences here. Again, we're having this discussion also on my deck here. We talked about that in my last discussion I had with you. So you're going to hear a lot of ambient noise, dogs barking in the background, but I think that's fine. You'll enjoy that. And it's a beautiful day outside. So let's talk about the resurrection again. In our last talk, I supported an argument that basically said that there were minimal core facts that almost all scholars believe on, that if you're going to explain about, you have to explain these particular facts if you want to deny the resurrection. Let's review what those facts were. The death of Jesus Christ, the despair and transformation of disciples, the disciples' claim to have seen the risen Christ, the empty tomb, and the conversion of Paul. Again, all five of those facts need to be explained or accounted for in some way or another. And I suggested that the best explanation for that is, in fact, the resurrection of Jesus. It explains all those facts very well. But other explanations have been offered, and we need to account, and we need to look at those. And those facts also, those explanations, also need to account for the five facts. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at the most plausible explanations. I can't look at every single explanation that's been offered there, but I'm going to certainly look at the most common ones, the ones that are out there. To start off, I want to say to you right away that all but one of these have already been dismissed by most scholars. And in fact, the person who did the greatest amount of work of answering these explanations was a skeptic, the 18th century skeptic, David Strauss. He went through all of these different explanations that are often given here, these what we call naturalistic arguments against the resurrection, and showed that none of them are very successful. But for Strauss, he didn't think we really needed to have a successful explanation anyway, because he didn't believe the resurrection actually happened, anything happened at all. He believed it was all a legend. It was all made up. It was all a fabrication. That was his natural explanation against the resurrection. And so I'm going to look at his explanation first. Now, what I've done here is I've divided these naturalistic explanations up into two categories here, what I call occupied tomb theories and empty tomb theories. The occupied tomb theories basically say that the tomb is still occupied, Jesus' body is still in the tomb, and we have an explanation for all of the other facts that are out there, okay? The empty tomb theories will say, okay, we have an empty tomb here, but we think we can explain that fact as well as all the other facts as well. So let's take a look at these theories. The first theory, the one that Strauss actually supported, was what we call the legend theory. The legend theory simply says the story of the resurrection never happened at all. None of those events really occurred. We don't have to explain any facts because nothing really happened here. It was all made up by the followers of Jesus over the many years between the death of Christ and the writing of the Gospels, which again are often dated very late, 80, 90, 100 AD, 50 to 70 years after the death of Christ. Those supporting this theory must submit to a long gap between the death of Christ and the Gospels because, first of all, too many people were still alive who would know whether it was true or not, okay? And if you're going to propose a resurrection and one didn't really happen, well, then you need to make sure that all those people that were around at the time, are already passed on, okay? And second of all, it just takes time for legends to grow. So you have to have a lengthy period of time here. But that is the biggest problem with this theory, okay? The biggest problem is the time frame simply doesn't allow for it. For example, Paul is already discussing the resurrection in his earliest letters. And again, these are scarcely 20 years later, okay? And in ancient times, 20 years is a very short amount of time here. However, I think we can even get closer if we study specifically the timeline of Paul and that he tells us in 1 Corinthians and Galatians in comparison to him and his ministry and the death of Jesus Christ and our knowledge of his movements here, okay? Let's put this timeline together here. Let's start off. Jesus died probably 30 to 33 AD. We don't know the exact day or even the exact year, but most scholars will put it somewhere around that time, 30 to 33 AD. Paul wrote his letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, okay, around 55 AD. That's a pretty well-established date for 1 Corinthians by, again, all scholars. So now we're talking 22 to 25 years after the death of Christ is when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul discusses the resurrection, okay? And in verses 1 through 3, he speaks of the gospel that he originally made known to the Corinthians. Now, for Paul, the gospel is always that Jesus died for your sins and rose from the dead. And Paul says he originally made this known to the Corinthians when he first met them. Well, when was that? Well, we again have that date fairly firmly established that Paul visited Corinth around 50 AD. So now we're talking about him preaching the gospel, which contains the resurrection of Jesus Christ, 17 to 20 years after the death of Christ here. So our time period has shrunk down considerably at this point. Paul then states that the gospel that he made known to them and what it was, and he states that in verses 3 through 4. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Almost all scholars recognize this particular statement as an early creedal statement. Okay? Paul also tells the Corinthians that he received this form, this early creedal statement, from others in authority. Question we want to ask is, when would that have been? Well, Galatians chapter 1 tells us that after Paul's conversion, he first went to Arabia and then later met with the leadership in Jerusalem. Now, assuming that Paul was converted very soon after the death of Christ, which is the best dates we seem to be able to come up with, about 1 to 2 years after Christ died, so we're talking 33 to 35 AD, somewhere in that area there, okay? This would place his meeting with the authorities, Peter and John and James, this would place this meeting about 34 to 36 AD. Okay, and is most likely where he would have received this particular form of the gospel, okay, that we have here. This creedal statement now, of course, was Paul received it about 34 to 36 AD, okay, but it would have had to have been around for some time to be formulated in such a formal way for Paul to have gotten it, which means the creedal statement itself was formed earlier than Paul's meeting with these apostolic leaders here, okay? Matter of fact, no less a historian than James D.G. Dunn says this: this tradition, this creedal statement, we can be entirely confident was formulated as a tradition within months of Jesus' death. See, we no longer have the long time period the legend theory requires. Okay, we in fact find out that the creedal statement concerning the resurrection of Jesus Christ was probably formulated within a few months after the death of Jesus. That's very, very early, and it knocks out any possibility for a legend theory to occur. The second of the occupied tomb theories is the wrong tomb theory. The wrong tomb theory simply says that the women in their grief and despair accidentally went to the wrong tomb, which happened to be unoccupied, and concluded that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay. Now, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus was buried, is an area about the size of today, about the size of a football field, and it actually had a number of tombs there. It certainly might be possible for the women in their grief to go to the wrong tomb, to say that that tomb was unoccupied. They went to an empty tomb instead of the tomb that Jesus had been buried at. That's what this theory basically says. But there are some problems with this theory. If the women went to the wrong tomb, well, so did others. For example, we're told that Peter and John later also went to the tomb. I guess they must have gone to the wrong tomb as well, okay? And not only Peter and John, but we have to ask the question, well, why didn't the Jewish authorities, when they started to preach the resurrection, why didn't they just go to the right tomb and get the body and bring the body out and cart the body through the streets at that particular time? Didn't they know where the right tomb was? Didn't anybody know where this right tomb was? It seems highly unrealistic to believe that everybody went to the wrong tomb here. Also, this doesn't account for the claims of the appearances the disciples had. The disciples claimed to have seen the risen Christ. And here's the key point. The disciples didn't believe Christ rose from the dead because the tomb was empty. They believed Christ rose from the dead because they saw the risen Christ, because they met with him, they had an encounter with him, okay? The empty tomb is evidence for that, okay? But that's not what led to their particular beliefs. So to say that the women went to the wrong tomb doesn't deal with all the facts. The third occupied tomb theory is the hallucination theory, okay? This theory basically says that the appearances of Christ were just mass hallucinations that the disciples shared with each other, okay? That they all had hallucinations and they thought they saw with Christ. Now, you got to remember Paul's testimony from 1 Corinthians. Paul says that 500 people saw Jesus at one time, as well as other appearances where other people saw him, okay? Is it possible that hallucinations can account for that? Well, not really, for a number of reasons. First of all, hallucinations are private mental occurrences. They occur inside the mind of individuals. They're not objective things that happen out here in reality. They happen inside people's minds. And they're not collective experiences. While it's true that many people might have a hallucination, people don't have the same hallucination because it occurs inside an individual person's mind at that particular point. So therefore, it's highly unlikely that they would all have the same hallucination about the exact same event. Okay. Second of all, it doesn't account for the despair of the disciples. Okay. Those having hallucinations are usually hopefully expecting to see something. For example, people oftentimes that are stranded, like in the middle of the ocean, or they're stranded in the middle of a desert, they'll have a hallucination about seeing something like an oasis or seeing a ship on the horizon, because they're hoping to experience that. But we know from the despair of the disciples, one of our 5 facts, that they weren't expecting to see the risen Jesus at all. Matter of fact, one of the things that's kind of amazing in the gospel accounts is when the disciples finally are told that Jesus rose from the dead, they're amazed. They're surprised by that. Now, we kind of wonder why. Jesus already told them about 50 million times throughout the gospel accounts, I'm going to rise from the dead, I'm going to rise from the dead, I'm going to rise from the dead. And yet still, they're surprised at seeing Jesus risen from the dead. But that does point out that they weren't expecting to see it. And that also would argue against hallucination. Okay. Finally, the disciples touched Christ. They ate with Christ. And hallucinations don't usually eat food. Okay, so the hallucination theory doesn't seem to work anyway. Well, the major problem for all 3 of these theories, of course, is they can't account for one of our facts we talked about, the empty tomb. So let's look at some theories that do want to argue, well, okay, the tomb is empty, but I still think I can give you a natural explanation for it. Okay? The first of these theories is that the disciples stole the body. They decided to fake the resurrection by sneaking in at night, moving the stone, stealing the body, and then proclaiming that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. This is the oldest naturalist explanation we actually find. We actually find it in the gospel accounts. Okay, Matthew 28, verse 13. We run into this where the Pharisees tell the soldiers, make sure you tell somebody that they stole the body. But there's several holes in this idea here. First of all, it goes against both the despair of the disciples, the fact that they were so hopeless, okay, and it goes against the character of the disciples as well. I mean, these are men, again, that were taught not to lie, not to produce a fraud here. And it would go against the very teachings of the person that they want to proclaim rose from the dead, okay? Also, if the Gospels are right about guards, okay, and that's debatable, but if they are right about guards, then it seems like the disciples would have to either overpower these guards or sneak in at night, okay, remove the stone, get Jesus out of the tomb, without in some way or another arousing the guards or getting their attention there. It makes it sound kind of silly here. We're talking about scared, frightened disciples here. We're not talking about Rambo here, or we're not talking about, you know, some great figure here who could do that kind of stuff. A third problem with the stealing of the body idea here is the disciples would have had to have lied about Jesus and would suffer persecution and martyrdom for something they knew was a lie. We know that the disciples were martyred for their what they believed here, that they suffered terribly for proclaiming the resurrection. Many people will suffer for stating something that's not true, but they really believe that it is true. People don't suffer for something that they know is false, that they know is not true, okay? And finally, it doesn't account for Paul's conversion. Fraud would be the first thing that Paul would have suspected, and Paul never raises the idea that he thinks there was a fraud going on here. So that fact isn't accounted for as well. Our second of our empty tomb theories is not that the disciples stole the body, but that the authorities moved the body. Fearing that the disciples might try to steal the body to claim a resurrection, the Jewish authorities moved the body, and the next morning the women came to an empty tomb. Well, if this really was the case, if this is what really happened, the authorities moved the body, okay, then this has got to be the biggest blunder in all of history. For it backfired completely. For the thing they wanted to avoid, that the disciples would proclaim a resurrection, is the exact same that happened. The disciples claimed the resurrection. Why didn't the authorities just simply produce the body at that point and show, see, we show you, he didn't really rise from the dead. The fact that they don't is evidence for that. And when Peter and James are brought before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 4, verse 18, for preaching the resurrection, did at that point the Sanhedrin produce the body? No, not at all. Matter of fact, the funny thing is you read that, it's really amazing. They don't even deny what Peter and James, or Peter and John are actually saying. They just tell them, don't talk about this anymore. Don't tell this to other people anymore. The fact that they don't even deny it, the fact that they just simply tell them, don't talk about this anymore, is strong evidence that the authorities had no idea where the body was at all. So the fact that they would move the body, that theory doesn't work at all. The final of our empty tomb theories is one that's become very popular in recent years, the swoon theory. This idea, of course, is that Jesus did not really die on the cross. He merely swooned, he fainted, okay? And in the coolness of the tomb, he awoke, he moved the stone, he overpowered the guards, and appeared before his disciples claiming to have risen from the dead. Well, this is a very, very suspicious idea here, explanation. I mean, automatically we should see major problems with it. First of all, it doesn't take the crucifixion seriously, nor the death of Christ. I mean, think about what's involved in crucifying somebody. If you study Roman crucifixion, these people were beaten, they were nailed to the cross, he had a spear thrust through his side, and these again were professional executors. That's all these men did, was execute people. It's highly unlikely that they would have been fooled into somebody swooning or fainting, okay? It denies one of the most accepted facts by all scholars, that Jesus Christ really died by crucifixion here. Okay. The second question we would have to ask him is, would the disciples really have believed it was Jesus without a resurrection body? Paul said that we would have a resurrection body like Jesus is his. But think about it for a second. If Jesus just swooned from the tomb and he just arose and got up and walked out of the tomb, he would be a bleeding, wounded mess of a man, dragging his carcass into Jerusalem, standing at the door when the disciples open the door, and there he is, this bleeding mess. I'm the risen Christ, believe in me. Would that really have caused the transformation we've talked about, that the disciples claiming to be the Jesus? I mean, they knew the difference between a resuscitation, a wounded man coming back to life, and a resurrection, okay, a dead man, okay, actually coming back to life here. They certainly would have seen the difference between those two. It's highly unlikely they would have believed in that. The point is this: none of these naturalistic explanations really do a very good job of explaining these 5 facts. And here's the point. You have to account for these 5 facts, okay, concerning the resurrection. What accounts for it the best? I would like to suggest I think the resurrection of Jesus accounts for it the best way you possibly can. Well, that's it for this particular talk, and that's it for all these talks we're doing. I hope these have been enlightening to you. I hope they've confirmed you in your faith and that you can use them as you share with others. Thank you very much.